What if I told you that a single battle, lasting just one day, determined the fate of all Europe for centuries to come? In the 16th century, the Mediterranean Sea was on the verge of becoming an Ottoman lake, and the Sultan's naval power was considered invincible. The Christian world, torn apart by internal conflicts, seemed to have nothing to oppose his force. However, on October 7, 1571, everything changed. It was the day when hundreds of galleys clashed in the last great battle of the Age of Oars, and amid the roar of cannons, a new naval supremacy was born. Watch the video to the end to find out how a single technological innovation decided the outcome of the battle and why this victory became a turning point in world history. What if I told you that the Battle of Lepanto was not just a battle, but a desperate response to an existential threat hanging over the whole of Europe? The second half of the 16th century was a time of undisputed Ottoman Empire domination. After the fall of Constantinople and the brilliant victories of Suleiman the Magnificent, Ottoman expansion seemed unstoppable, and the Mediterranean Sea became an arena for demonstrating their naval power. European kingdoms, on the other hand, were divided, mired in political intrigue and religious conflict. The empire, stretching from the gates of Vienna to the shores of the Persian Gulf, possessed enormous resources. Sultan Selim II, who inherited the throne from his illustrious father, sought to complete what had been started and establish complete control over the sea lanes. His fleet, based in Istanbul and at North African corsair bases, was the largest and most experienced in the world, and his soldiers, the famous Janissaries, were considered invincible infantry. The main target for the Ottomans at sea was the Venetian Republic. Once the powerful Queen of the Adriatic, which had built its empire on maritime trade, it now found itself in a tight spot. Ottoman conquests in the Balkans and the Aegean Sea deprived it of many colonies and trading posts. Venice desperately tried to maintain its neutrality and trading privileges, but conflict was inevitable. Venice's last and most valuable possession in the eastern Mediterranean was the island of Cyprus. It was of enormous strategic importance, located at the crossroads of trade routes to the Levant and Egypt. For the Ottomans, Cyprus was a thorn in their side, a Christian outpost that prevented them from achieving complete domination in the region. In 1570, Sultan Selim issued an ultimatum to Venice, demanding the immediate surrender of the island. The Venetian Senate, realizing that they could not withstand the Ottomans alone, indignantly rejected the ultimatum. This was tantamount to a declaration of war. A huge Ottoman invasion fleet sailed to the shores of Cyprus, and the siege of the island's key fortresses began. The capital, Nicosia, fell first, after which all the forces of the Ottoman army under the command of Lala Mustafa Pasha concentrated on the last stronghold of the Venetians, the port city of Famagusta. The defense of Famagusta became one of the most dramatic episodes of that war. A small Venetian garrison under the command of Marcantonio Bragadino held out for almost a year, repelling numerous assaults and suffering from a lack of supplies. Their heroic resistance gave Europe precious time, but their fate was sealed. In August 1571, having exhausted all possibilities of resistance, Bragadin agreed to an honorable surrender. Lala Mustafa Pasha promised the defenders free passage with their weapons and transportation to Crete. However, as soon as the city was surrendered, the terms of the agreement were treacherously violated. The Ottoman commander, struck by the tenacity of the Venetians and his own losses, broke his word of honor. This event, which became known throughout Europe, caused a wave of shock and outrage. The news of the fall of Famagusta and the breach of the treaty was the last straw that broke the camel's back. In Rome, Pope Pius IV, a tireless advocate of Christian unity, used this event as his main argument. He called on European monarchs to put aside their differences in the face of a common threat. His calls were finally heard. The Spanish Empire, led by King Philip II, was the dominant power in the Western Mediterranean. Although Spain was fighting its own battle against the Ottoman allies, the Barbary pirates, it had long viewed Venice, its commercial rival, with suspicion. However, the threat had now become too great, and Philip agreed to join the coalition. After long and difficult negotiations, in the spring of 1571, the Holy League was officially proclaimed. It included the Papal See, the Spanish Empire, the Venetian Republic, the Republic of Genoa, the Knights of Malta, and several other Italian states. Their common goal was to assemble a fleet capable of challenging Ottoman power and stopping their expansion. It was a fragile and unprecedented union of eternal rivals in the name of common survival. We are very interested to hear your opinion. What do you think about how long-standing rivals were able to unite in the face of a global threat? Write about it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the continuation of this incredible story. Are you ready to learn the truth about the human and material resources that were thrown into the furnace of this grand confrontation? The assembly of the Holy League's fleet was in itself a miracle of logistics and diplomacy. Messina in Sicily, a strategic port controlled by Spain, was designated as the assembly point. Throughout the summer of 1571, ships and men from all over the Christian Mediterranean flocked there, and the sight was breathtaking. The League's fleet was a true embodiment of the patchwork quilt of European politics. Spain provided the largest and most powerful squadron, including ships from Naples, Sicily, and Genoa, which was under its influence. The Venetians, despite their recent losses, fielded a huge number of galleys built at their famous arsenal. The Papacy, the Knights of Malta, and other Italian duchies made their own, albeit smaller but important, contributions. In total, the Allies managed to assemble more than 200 galleys, several dozen auxiliary vessels, and most importantly, 6 unique ships on which special hopes were pinned. The total number of crews and soldiers on board exceeded 80,000. It was the largest Christian armada ever seen in the Mediterranean. However, gathering the ships was only half the battle. They had to be commanded. The question of supreme command was one of the most difficult. The Venetians and Spaniards did not trust each other, and each side feared that the other would pursue only its own interests. In the end, Don John of Austria, the half-brother of Spanish King Philip II, became the compromise figure. He was young, only 24 years old, but he had already proven himself to be a charismatic and capable military leader. His youth energy and undoubted devotion to the Catholic faith made him the ideal candidate to unite the disparate allies. The most experienced admirals of his time served under him. Among them were Andrea Doria, a veteran from Genoa and representative of a famous naval dynasty, and Sebastiano Venier, an elderly and unyielding Venetian commander who was eager to avenge Famagusta. The presence of so many strong personalities in one headquarters caused constant friction. The logistics and supply of such a huge fleet were a nightmare. Tens of thousands of people had to be fed, they had to be paid, and the ships required constant repairs, fresh water, and supplies. In Messina, quarrels and fights constantly broke out between soldiers of different nationalities. Don Juan had to display extraordinary diplomatic skills to maintain order and unity in his camp. Meanwhile, the Ottoman fleet, having won a victory in Cyprus, was also preparing for a decisive confrontation. Their armada was no less, and according to some estimates, even more numerous than that of the Holy League. The Sultan ordered his chief admiral, Muzinzade Ali Pasha, to find and destroy the Christian fleet wherever it was. The Ottomans' confidence in their invincibility was at its peak. Ali Pasha was a brave warrior and a favorite of the Sultan, although he did not have much naval experience. His flagship, the Sultan, was one of the largest and most richly decorated galleys in the entire fleet. Under his command were far more experienced sea dogs, such as Aluj Ali, the fearsome corsair and ruler of Algeria, who commanded the left wing. He was Italian by birth, having entered the service of the Sultan, and knew Christian tactics like no one else. The Ottoman ships were mainly classic galleys, honed over centuries for warfare in the Mediterranean. Their strength lay in their speed, maneuverability, and above all, their experienced boarding crews. The Janissaries and other elite warriors on board were masters of close combat, and Ottoman tactics were based on getting as close to the enemy as possible, boarding them, and deciding the outcome in hand-to-hand combat. Unlike the Christian fleet, the Ottoman fleet was more homogeneous and obeyed a single command. They had no internal disagreements about tactics or goals. Their morale was high, they had just won a great victory and believed in their superiority. In the fall of 1571, they stood in the Gulf of Lepanto, at the entrance to the Gulf of Corinth, confidently awaiting the enemy. Thus, all the pieces were in place for the coming grand confrontation. What do you think is more important for victory? Technological superiority or unity of command and morale. But what if I told you that the Christians had a secret technological ace up their sleeve that the Ottomans didn't even suspect? Read on to the next chapter to find out what this unique weapon was. I will reveal the most closely guarded secret of the Venetian arsenal, which was to change the rules of naval warfare. Among the hundreds of galleys gathered in Messina, 6 ships stood out, unlike anything else. These were galleasses, a unique design by Venetian shipbuilders. They were to play one of the key roles in the upcoming battle, becoming a real technological shock for the Ottoman fleet. The galleass was the Venetian engineers' answer to the main challenge of the era: how to combine the maneuverability of a rowing galley with the firepower of a sailing galleon. The traditional galley was fast and could move independently of the wind, but it was very vulnerable. It carried almost all of its armament, usually 3 to 5 cannons at the bow, as side guns would interfere with the rowers. This meant that the galley could only fire straight ahead. Sailing ships, on the other hand, already carried dozens of cannons on their sides, but were completely dependent on the wind. In calm conditions, so common in the Mediterranean, they became helpless targets for maneuverable galleys. The Venetians tried to take the best of both worlds and created a hybrid. The galleass was, in essence, a giant, super heavy galley, equipped with a huge amount of artillery. The size of the galleass was impressive. It was almost twice as wide and significantly taller than a regular galley. This allowed for several decks to be placed on it. The lower deck, like that of a galley, was reserved for rowers, but there were many more of them, and they sat in an enclosed space. The upper deck, on the other hand, was a veritable artillery battery, the likes of which the world had never seen before. Unlike a galley which could only fire forward, a galleass was armed all around. Several heavy guns were mounted at the bow and stern, but its main strength was dozens of cannons of various calibers installed along the sides. This allowed the ship to deliver devastating fire in any direction. In essence, it was a floating fortress capable of single-handedly opposing an entire enemy squadron. However, this firepower came at a price. Galleasses were incredibly slow and unwieldy. Even with hundreds of rowers, they could barely reach speed sufficient to maneuver in battle. They were too heavy to keep up with fast galleys. This made their use in battle a very risky undertaking. Many admirals of the Holy League, especially those of the old school, were skeptical of these giants. They considered them clumsy and useless in decisive combat. However, Don Juan and the Venetian engineers had a special plan for them. They were not to participate in the maneuvering phase of the battle or pursue the enemy. Their task was different: to become a breakwater against which the first and most furious attack of the Ottomans would break. The plan was to tow these 6 galleasses far ahead of the main line of the Christian fleet. They were to divide into 3 groups of 2 and anchor or drift, waiting for the enemy. The Ottomans, going on the attack, would inevitably have to pass through them or try to bypass them. In either case, they would come under crossfire from dozens of cannons. This tactical plan was completely innovative for its time. It completely changed the centuries-old paradigm of naval combat, which had been reduced to ramming and boarding. Instead, the Christians relied on their superiority in artillery. They wanted to inflict maximum damage on the enemy before the ships came into close contact. It was a gamble that could either bring a resounding victory or end in disaster. The Ottoman commanders knew nothing about this new weapon. Their intelligence reported on the size of the Christian fleet, but not on the qualitative changes in its composition. They were preparing for a traditional galley battle, where their superiority in the training of boarding teams was undeniable. They had no idea that they would encounter floating batteries capable of wreaking havoc on their dense battle formations. These 6 ships were the material embodiment of the technological gap that was beginning to emerge between Europe and the Ottoman Empire. While the Ottomans perfected old tactics, the Europeans, and especially the Venetians, were already moving into a new era, the era of gunpowder and heavy artillery. The Battle of Lepanto was to be the first and most severe test for this new, secret weapon. If you enjoy learning about unique technological solutions that change the course of history, please like this video. What if I showed you a time machine and we traveled to the deck of Don Juan's flagship as it sailed from Messina? In mid-September 1571, after months of grueling waiting and constant deliberation, the Holy League fleet finally left Messina. Don Juan gave the order to weigh anchor. It was an unforgettable sight. More than 200 warships and 100 support vessels, decorated with banners and flags, sailed out into the Ionian Sea. The journey eastward was not easy. The weather was changeable, and the fleet had to constantly battle storms that scattered the ships. But the main problem was not the weather, but internal disagreements. The conflict between the Venetian admiral Venier and the Spanish commanders reached a boiling point. Venier, impulsive and proud, was unwilling to obey orders that he felt undermined Venice's interests. At one point, the tension became so intense that Don John of Austria was forced to use all his power and authority. He convened a council of war, at which he categorically demanded an end to all disputes. He reminded the admirals of the main goal of their mission, of their faith, and of the common threat. His charisma and status as supreme commander had an effect, and the fragile unity was restored. During the campaign, new ships joined the fleet, and scouts constantly reported on the location of the Ottoman Armada. The Christians learned that Ali Pasha was stationed with all his forces in the Gulf of Lepanto, not far from the entrance to the Gulf of Corinth. It was an ideal sheltered anchorage, but it could also become a trap if the Ottomans decided to engage in battle in the narrow space. The hardest blow to the fleet was the news received on the island of Kefalonia. It was there that Don Juan and his admirals finally learned of the fate of Famagusta. The details of the violation of the surrender agreement and the cruel treatment of Marcantonio Bragadin enraged the entire fleet. The Venetians were particularly shocked. From that moment on, the battle ceased to be merely a political necessity. It became a matter of honor and revenge. This tragic news also had a positive effect. It finally united the Allies. All disputes and disagreements faded into the background in the face of a common destiny. Don Juan made a decision to immediately go to Lepanto and give the Ottomans a decisive battle. He no longer doubted the determination of his men. Meanwhile, heated debates were also taking place in the Ottoman camp. Ali Pasha received a direct order from the Sultan to attack and destroy the Christians. However, his most experienced admiral, Ulugh Ali, strongly advised against taking such a risk. He proposed taking refuge in the fortified harbor of Lepanto and allowing the Christian fleet to disband on its own due to a lack of supplies and the onset of winter storms. Ulugh Ali argued that even if the Ottomans lost, it would be a disaster, and if they won, they would simply destroy a fleet that would soon become obsolete anyway. However, Ali Pasha could not disobey the Sultan's direct order. In addition, he and other commanders were confident in their numerical and qualitative superiority. Mocking the infidels who dared to challenge them was commonplace. In the end, it was decided to leave the bay and meet the Christian fleet in the open sea. Early in the morning of October 7, 1571, the Ottoman ships began to leave the harbor of Lepanto. At almost the same time, the Christian fleet, sailing from the west, passed a group of small islands. The two greatest fleets in history, with a total of more than 400 ships, finally saw each other at dawn. The moment of truth had arrived. Don John of Austria ordered the sacred blue banner with the image of the crucifix to be raised on his flagship. Priests read prayers throughout the Christian fleet. Drums sounded and calls to battle rang out on the Ottoman ships. The sea was calm with a light headwind, which initially gave the Ottoman galleys an advantage. Battle was inevitable. How do you think the young 24-year-old commander, who bore the responsibility for the fate of the entire Christian world, must have felt? In the next chapter, you will learn how the opponents positioned their forces before the start of this grand battle. The two armadas meeting in the narrow strait were a striking sight. It was the culmination of a century-long arms race in the Mediterranean. Both fleets were arranged in the traditional battle formation, a long line divided into three main divisions: center, right flank, and left flank. In addition, each fleet had a tactical reserve located behind the central group. Don John of Austria commanded the center of the Christian fleet. His flagship galley, the Real, was one of the most powerful ships in the Armada, a true work of art of Spanish shipbuilding. Next to him, to demonstrate unity, were the flagships of other key commanders: Marcantonio Colonna from the Papal States and Sebastiano Venier from Venice. In total, more than 60 galleys were concentrated in the center. The Christian left flank, which rested against the coast, was commanded by the experienced Venetian admiral Agostino Barbarigo. His task was to prevent the Ottomans from bypassing him along the coast, where shallow waters could create problems for maneuvering. This flank consisted mainly of Venetian galleys, whose crews knew these waters well. The right southern flank was commanded by the Genoese Andrea Doria. He was the most experienced, but also the most controversial of the League's admirals. His squadron was to oppose the most dangerous of the Ottoman commanders, Ulucu Ali. Doria was ordered to stay in the open sea, not giving the enemy the opportunity to maneuver around him. Behind the center, as the supreme commander's last resort, was a powerful reserve. It was commanded by one of the best Spanish naval commanders, the Marquis of Santa Cruz. His squadron of 30 galleys was to come to the aid of the section where the most critical situation arose. It was a wise decision, which ultimately played a decisive role. But Don Juan's main tactical innovation was the positioning of those 6 galleasses. Contrary to all tradition, he ordered them to be towed and positioned about a mile in front of his main line. 2 galleasses covered each of the 3 sectors. They were to be the first to encounter the Ottoman fleet, disrupt its formation with their hurricane artillery fire, and sow panic even before the main battle began. The Ottoman fleet was arranged in a similar mirror formation. In the center, directly opposite Don Juan, Ali Pasha himself commanded his squadron. His flagship, the Sultan, was a magnificent ship carrying the sacred banner of the Prophet, which gave the battle a special religious status. Ali Pasha was determined to engage in combat with the Christian flagship. The Ottoman right flank, which faced the Christian left wing under Barbarigo's command, was commanded by Mehmet Sirako. He was an experienced admiral, and his task was also to try to outflank the enemy in shallow water. The left flank, the strongest flank of the Ottomans, was commanded by Ulucu Ali. His squadron of Algerian corsairs was the fastest and most maneuverable in the entire fleet. The Ottoman fleet slightly outnumbered the Christian fleet, especially in terms of galleys, which were lighter and faster ships. However, their artillery armament was generally weaker. The Ottomans still relied on maneuvering, ramming, and boarding, where their elite archers and janissaries were unmatched. When the Ottoman ships moved forward, they were surprised to find 6 strange, cumbersome vessels standing directly in their path. They mistook them for clumsy transport ships and, seeing no particular threat in them, decided to simply bypass them. This was a fatal mistake. As soon as the Ottoman galleys entered range, the galleasses opened fire. It was not the kind of fire the Ottomans were used to. A few cannons from the bow. It was a barrage of cannonballs from all sides. The heavy cannons of the floating fortresses fired at the dense ranks of the advancing galleys, inflicting enormous damage. The Ottomans' formation became disordered. Many ships were seriously damaged, and their morale was shattered before they could even fire a single shot. Are you ready to learn the truth about how the heart of this grand battle unfolded? Breaking through the curtain of fire from the galleasses, albeit with heavy losses, the Ottoman center, led by Ali Pasha, rushed toward the main Christian line. Ali Pasha, ignoring the chaos wreaked by the floating fortresses, saw only one target before him, Don Juan's flagship. He wanted to decide the outcome of the battle in a traditional knightly duel between the 2 admirals. Don John of Austria accepted the challenge. He ordered his flagship, the Real, to sail straight towards the Sultan. The 2 giant ships, symbols of 2 empires and 2 faiths, collided at full speed. The bows of the galleys crashed into each other, and at that very moment, hundreds of soldiers from both sides rushed to board the ships. The battle in the center instantly turned into a fierce fight on the decks of the 2 locked flagship ships. The battle for the Real and the Sultan became the epicenter of the entire Battle of Lepanto. Other galleys immediately gathered around the 2 flagships, rushing to the aid of their commanders. Christian ships, such as the galleys of Marcantonio Colonna and Sebastiano Venera, moved in close, creating a huge floating platform of several interlocked ships. A real land battle unfolded on this platform. Spanish and Italian arquebusiers, protected by special protective nets against arrows, fired continuously at the deck of the Sultana. The Ottoman janissaries and archers responded with equal ferocity. Boarding parties moved from one ship to another several times. At one point, the Ottoman warriors managed to capture part of the deck of the Real, and Don Juan's flagship was in serious danger. At this critical moment, Don Juan personally led the counterattack, showing incredible composure. But the decisive factor was the arrival of reinforcements. Seeing the desperate situation in the center, the Marquis of Santa Cruz immediately sent some of his fresh galleys to help the flagship. The arrival of reinforcements turned the tide of the battle on the reel. The Spanish soldiers, having received support, attacked the Sultan with renewed vigor. They managed to break through to the deck of the Ottoman flagship. The battle was short but fierce. Ali Pasha, commander of the Ottoman fleet, who was fighting in the front ranks, was defeated. His fall caused instant panic among the crew. The capture of the Sultan and the death of the commander-in-chief were a turning point in the battle for the center. The sacred banner of the Prophet, flying from the mast of the Ottoman flagship, was lowered. This event, which was visible from most ships, had a huge demoralizing effect on the entire Ottoman fleet. The Christian crews, on the other hand, were inspired by this sign of victory. After the fall of the flagship, the Ottoman center fell apart. Deprived of unified command and shaken by the death of their leader, the galleys began to fight separately. The Christian ships, acting more cohesively, boarded them one after another. The Christians' superiority in firearms and protective equipment for soldiers in close combat proved decisive. While this fierce battle raged in the center, equally dramatic events unfolded on the flanks. The battle was not yet won, and the outcome of the entire battle depended on whether Admirals Doria and Barbarigo could hold their lines against the elite forces of the Ottoman naval commanders. What do you think would have happened if the Ottomans had prevailed in this central confrontation? In the next chapter, we will learn about the desperate struggle that unfolded on the northern flank, where the Venetians faced the threat of being outflanked in shallow water. While the two flagships clashed in a deadly battle in the center, a drama of its own was unfolding on the northern, left flank of the Christian Armada. This wing, adjacent to the coast, was commanded by the Venetian Agostino Barbarigo. He was opposed by the experienced Ottoman admiral Mehmet Sirocco, who had received clear orders to bypass the Christian fleet in shallow water and strike its flank and rear. Mehmet Sirocco, who knew these waters well, directed his galleys into a narrow passage between the last Venetian ship and the shore. It was a risky but tactically sound maneuver. If it had succeeded, the entire left flank of the Christians would have been caught in a pincer movement, which could have led to disaster for the entire army of the Holy League. However, Agostino Barbarigo saw through the enemy's plan. He was an old and experienced sea dog who did not allow himself to be deceived. He immediately turned several of his galleys, including his own flagship, bow to the shore to block this flanking maneuver. A fierce battle ensued in the most difficult part of the bay to maneuver. The galleys fought in shallow water, constantly risking running aground. It was an unusual battle for large ships, more like a chaotic brawl. The Venetian crews, accustomed to similar conditions in their lagoons, fought with desperate tenacity. They understood that they were responsible for defending the entire flank. Mehmet Sirocco personally led his ships into the attack. During a fierce boarding battle, his flagship clashed with Barbarigo's flagship. The battle went back and forth with the decks changing hands. In the heat of the battle, Agostino Barbarigo, who was fighting with his visor open to better see the course of the battle, was wounded. An arrow struck him in the eye, and the wound proved fatal. The loss of their commander could have broken the spirit of the Venetians, but the opposite happened. Barbarigo's nephew, Marco Contarini, immediately took command. Wanting to avenge their uncle, the Venetians attacked the Ottoman ships with redoubled fury. Their onslaught was so strong that the Ottomans faltered. Mehmet Sirocco himself was also seriously wounded in the battle. His flagship was captured, and he himself, having fallen overboard, was pulled out of the water and taken to a Venetian ship. With the loss of both commanders, Barbarigo and Sirocco, the battle on the flank did not subside, but turned into a series of scattered but extremely fierce skirmishes. The decisive role in this part of the battle was played not so much by the admiral's talents as by the training and perseverance of individual crews. The Venetians, fighting for their homes and avenging Cyprus, showed remarkable bravery. They were able not only to stop the flanking maneuver, but also to begin to squeeze the Ottoman right flank. Many Ottoman galleys, trapped between Christian ships in the shore, found themselves trapped. Some captains, in desperation, beached their ships, trying to escape on land. By noon, it was clear that the right flank of the Ottoman army had been completely destroyed. The threat of encirclement had been eliminated, and the left wing of the Christian fleet had won a complete victory. This victory, however, came at a high price. The Christians lost one of their main admirals, but their steadfastness allowed the center and reserves to focus on solving other, no less dangerous problems. And the greatest danger at that moment was brewing on the southern flank, where the two most cunning admirals of the era were playing their own deadly game. While in the north the battle was fought close to the shore, on the southern right flank of the Christians, a completely different picture was unfolding. Here in the open sea, the two most outstanding and cunning naval commanders of their time clashed. Andrea Doria of Genoa, who commanded the right wing of the Holy League, and Ulugh Ali, the formidable corsair and ruler of Algiers, who led the left wing of the Ottomans. Andrea Doria was a representative of the old school. He feared that Ulugh Ali, known for his daring maneuvers, would use the superiority of his fast galleys to outflank him from the south and strike the rear of the Christian center. To prevent this, Doria began to shift his squadron further and further south, trying to stretch the line and prevent himself from being outflanked. Doria's maneuver had disastrous consequences. A huge, dangerous gap began to form between his squadron and the Christian center commanded by Don Juan. The line of the Holy League, which was supposed to be continuous, was broken. This was exactly what Ulugh Ali had been waiting for. Ulugh Ali was a master of deception. He pretended that he was really going to outflank Doria from the south, drawing him along with him. But as soon as the gap between Doria and the center became large enough, the Algerian corsair gave his ships an unexpected order. He sharply turned his squadron north and rushed not to bypass Doria, but straight into the gap that had formed. It was a brilliant tactical move. Ulugh Ali ignored Doria's squadron, leaving it far out at sea, and struck at the most vulnerable spot, the right flank of the Christian center. Several galleys at the rear of Don Juan's line came under attack from the fresh and numerous Algerian forces. The situation instantly became critical. Ulugh Ali's ships sowed chaos. They attacked from the flank, where the Christian galleys were least protected. His particular target was the galleys of the Order of Malta, known for their valor. The flagship of the Knights was boarded and captured. Ulugh Ali even managed to recapture several Ottoman galleys that had already been captured by the Christians. At that moment, it seemed that luck had turned its back on the Holy League. The victory in the center, where Ali Pasha had been defeated, could be nullified by this daring breakthrough. Andrea Doria, realizing his mistake, turned his ships around too late and was too far away to come to the rescue in time. But Don Juan had another trump card. The very reserve under the command of the Marquis of Santa Cruz. The Marquis, who had already come to the aid of the center, immediately assessed the new threat. He divided his forces and sent most of his remaining fresh galleys to intercept Ulugh Ali. The third decisive phase of the battle began. Ulugh Ali's squadron, already weighed down by captured ships, faced the fresh, powerful galleys of the Christian reserve. At the same time, ships from the already victorious Christian center began to approach to help. Ulugh Ali looked around and realized he was trapped. As a true corsair, he valued freedom and his fleet more than blind valor. He saw that the center and right flank of the Ottoman army had been completely destroyed, and his own admiral, Ali Pasha, had been killed. Continuing the battle meant certain death. Making a difficult but correct decision, Ulugh Ali gave the order to retreat. He gathered around him those ships that were still able to move, abandoned some of the captured booty, and, taking advantage of their speed, broke out of the encirclement. He was the only Ottoman commander who managed to save a significant part of his squadron. His daring maneuver almost changed the course of the battle, but in the end only delayed the inevitable. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the Battle of Lepanto was over. What had been two mighty and proud fleets that morning was now a chaotic cluster of drifting, damaged, and captured ships. The scale of the Holy League's victory was staggering and exceeded even the wildest expectations. The Ottoman fleet, which had terrorized the Mediterranean for decades, had essentially ceased to exist. Of the nearly 300 Ottoman ships that went into battle that morning, only Ulugh Ali's squadron managed to escape, with only about 30 or 40 galleys. The vast majority were either captured or disabled. The Christian fleet captured more than 130 enemy galleys, which were towed away as trophies. But the most important and humanitarian component of the victory was the liberation of thousands of slave rowers chained to Ottoman oars. According to various estimates, between 12 and 15,000 people, many of whom were Christians captured in previous campaigns and raids, gained their freedom that day. Their jubilation mingled with the joy of the victors. The losses of the Holy League were also significant. Several dozen galleys were put out of action, but only about 15 were completely lost. Human losses were heavy, but incomparable to those suffered by the enemy. The Christian world paid a high price for this victory, including the life of one of its admirals, Agostino Barbarigo. News of the victory spread across Europe at varying speeds. The first to learn of it was Pope Pius of Rome, who, according to legend, had a vision of the outcome of the battle on that very day, October 7th. When the messenger from Venice finally arrived in Rome with official confirmation, the city erupted in jubilation. A Thanksgiving service was held in St. Peter's Cathedral. The news came as a salvation to Venice. The city, which had been in mourning for Cyprus, was lifted in spirit. This victory was first and foremost their victory, paid for with their ships and their admiral. In Spain, King Philip II, known for his restraint, also ordered celebrations. All of Catholic Europe celebrated what seemed like a miracle, the defeat of the invincible Ottomans. The symbolic significance of the battle could not be overestimated. For the first time in a long time, the Ottoman Empire suffered a crushing defeat at sea. The myth of the invincibility of their fleet was dispelled. It was a tremendous morale boost for the Christian world, which felt that the Sultan's expansion could not only be contained, but also reversed. The Battle of Lepanto instantly became legendary. Poems were composed, paintings and poems were written about it. Miguel de Cervantes, the future author of Don Quixote, who participated in the battle as a simple soldier aboard one of the galleys and was wounded there, called it the greatest event that the centuries have seen. However, behind this triumph and euphoria lay more complex political realities. The Holy League was created for one purpose: to destroy the Ottoman fleet. That goal was achieved, and as soon as the common threat disappeared, old contradictions between the allies immediately resurfaced. Don Juan and other commanders wanted to build on their success, perhaps even attempt to recapture Cyprus or attack Istanbul. But this required unity, which no longer existed. The Venetians, who had borne the brunt of the costs and losses, wanted peace in order to restore their trade. The Spanish, meanwhile, were more concerned with their affairs in the Netherlands and the New World. The League, having achieved its greatest victory, began to fall apart. The Battle of Lepanto is often called the last great battle of the galleys. It was the grand finale of an entire era of naval warfare that had lasted since ancient times. For thousands of years, oars, not sails, had been the main propulsion for warships in the Mediterranean. The outcome of a battle was decided by ramming and boarding. Lepanto was the apogee of this tactic, and also its swan song. It was in this battle that the power of the new god of war, heavy artillery, became abundantly clear. The success of the 6 Venetian galleasses was the prologue to a new era. These clumsy giants proved that firepower could completely change the course of a battle even before the ships came into close contact. Their cannons inflicted damage on the Ottoman fleet from which it was never able to recover. The Christian fleet as a whole had more than twice the superiority in terms of the number and quality of its guns. Spanish and Venetian galleys carried more cannons, and their crews were better trained. Most of the soldiers on board were armed with arquebuses, while the Ottomans still relied heavily on archers. Lepanto was a triumph of gunpowder over muscle power. This battle taught European naval theorists an invaluable lesson. The future lay not with fast rowing vessels, but with large sailing ships capable of carrying dozens of heavy guns on board. This was the path chosen by the Atlantic powers: Spain, followed by England, Holland, and France. The era of the galley was coming to an end, and the era of the ship of the line was dawning. In the short term, however, the consequences of the battle were not so clear-cut. The Ottoman Empire demonstrated remarkable resilience. The Grand Vizier famously said to the Venetian ambassador, "By taking Cyprus from you, we have cut off your arm. By destroying our fleet, you have only shaved our beard. A severed arm will not grow back, but a shaved beard will grow back even thicker." Indeed, in just one winter, the Ottomans, using all the resources of their vast empire, built a new fleet that was equal in size to the old one. The following year, Ulugh Ali, who had become the new commander-in-chief, sent more than 200 galleys out to sea. However, as he himself bitterly admitted, ships can be built, but admirals and experienced sailors cannot be found so quickly. The loss of thousands of experienced sailors, archers and janissaries at Lepanto was irreplaceable. The Holy League, on the contrary, was unable to reap the fruits of its victory. Internal strife led to Venice, exhausted by war, concluding a separate peace with the Ottoman Empire as early as 1573. Under its terms, Venice not only officially ceded Cyprus, but also undertook to pay the Sultan a huge indemnity. This looked like a diplomatic defeat after a military victory. Nevertheless, in the long run, the Battle of Lepanto was of fundamental importance. It finally stopped Ottoman expansion in the Western Mediterranean. Although the Ottomans retained control of its eastern part, they never again made such large-scale attempts to challenge the combined forces of Europe. For Europe, this victory had enormous psychological and cultural significance. It strengthened European identity and gave impetus to the development of technology, especially naval technology. Superiority based on artillery and ocean-going sailing ships allowed European powers to establish their dominance not only in the Mediterranean, but also throughout the world's oceans in the centuries that followed. The Battle of Lepanto did not mark the end of the Ottoman Empire, but it did mark the beginning of the end of its naval supremacy. It was a bloody and resounding finale to the Age of Oars and a fierce, smoky dawn of the Age of Cannons. The symbolic blow to Ottoman pride proved more important than the immediate strategic gains. Europe believed in its own strength, and that belief changed the world. Thus, October 7, 1571, became more than just a date on the calendar. It was the day when technology, tactics, and the will to win converged at a single point to forever change the balance of power on the world stage. The roar of the galleys cannons at Lepanto echoed through the centuries, heralding the birth of a new maritime order that would shape the coming centuries. We have taken a detailed look at one of the most spectacular and decisive naval battles in history. The Battle of Lepanto was not just a clash between two fleets, but a battle between two worlds, two technologies, and two naval philosophies. It was a triumph of artillery over boarding and the symbolic end of the era of galleys, which had dominated the Mediterranean for thousands of years. Although this victory did not bring immediate political benefits to the Holy League, it forever dispelled the myth of Ottoman invincibility at sea. It gave Europe a moral boost and a technological advantage that ultimately led to its naval dominance throughout the world. The story of Lepanto is a reminder that even the most powerful empire can be vulnerable, and that a single technological breakthrough, applied at the right moment, can change the course of history. What other great battles of the past that became turning points in history would you like us to explore in detail? Suggest topics for future videos in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our next investigations.